Olena Halushka is a board member of the Ukrainian NGO Anti-Corruption Action Center and co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. She's also worked as a chief of international advocacy at the post-Maidan coalition of 80 CSOs, the Reanimation Package of Reforms. Olena is a contributor to the Atlantic Council, Kyiv Independent, and many other publications. She's also written op-eds for the Washington Post, the Foreign Policy, and EU Observer, but it's the major article that she recently co-wrote for the UK's Guardian newspaper that we'll be discussing today. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help people find the fantastic speakers that we feature. And it's never been more important to hear Ukrainian voices as well. Please do consider becoming a patron to support the work of the channel or buy me a coffee. Well, let's jump straight to the questions, because the main topic we're going to talk about are how we can get the funds to Ukraine to continue not just survival, but actually turn the war around. So you've written this brilliant piece in The Guardian. What feedback have you had so far?
Well, this piece, I would say, is the kind of a summary of our advocacy activities for the last few months, because we started this very big Make Russia Pay campaign back in September. We realized that it's going to be hard time with getting more money for Ukraine, unfortunately. That is that very bitter moment when you wanted to prove wrong, but unfortunately you were right. And we decided to reinforce our activities on the confiscation of Russian assets simply because, on one hand, this is morally right and justified to do. Then, there is a very strong counter argument against the Western hesitancy to continue supporting us with the Western taxpayers' money, that we are extremely grateful for every dollar and euro that we are receiving. But if you do not want to continue supporting us with your taxpayers' money, you are sitting at the Western $300 billion assets of the central bank. Go and confiscate them, and that will be enough, to help Ukraine defend ourselves, do the recovery, and compensate partly the damages for the victims. So since September, we had many meetings with the foreign decision makers. We targeted mostly the key European countries like France, Germany, UK, also the US, Canada, and obviously the remaining two members of G7, Italy and Japan, definitely need to be on the focus of our activities too. And, during this advocacy, we were hearing a number of arguments, many of which are actually myths, and they are ungrounded. And we tried, to respond with a very clear evidence-based arguments that are explained in details in our legal and economic brief. But my understanding is, and my feeling is, because we advocated for the confiscation of Russian assets since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, and over the first year, it was an absolutely harsh and hardcore no. Every time we started talking about the confiscation of assets, we heard, no, it's impossible, it's illegal, we won't be like Russians. Russians are violating the international law, and we can nobly and gently, stick to it. We won't repeat what Russians are doing. That is why, there is not that much need, urgent pressing need for money. So everything is fine. Right now, the situation is changing because everybody understands that we are in the protracted war. And that's, by the way, something we were warning last year when we were advocating for the maximum weapons, modern battle tanks, fighter jets, and everything else, granted us in time which would help us to liberate the much more territories that are currently occupied. And we explained that, you know, this is our window, this was our momentum. And right now everybody realizes that, you know, the more proper weapons arrived by the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive, the less defense lines Russians could have been built by now. So, and we were asking that in the protracted war, it would be very complicated for Ukraine to win because we are a much smaller country, our mobilization potential is smaller, but also this is our economy, which Russia destroys. And, you know, sanctions, we were expecting the sanctions to work, but, you know, none of the sanctions would decrease Russian GDP by 30%, like the Russian full-scale invasion had decreased Ukrainian GDP in the first year of the war, full-scale war. But unfortunately, those fears, those concerns were ignored, and we are where we are. So our understanding is that many partners also started realizing that there's not much other options, because the reality is that we do not have, you know, hundreds of baskets of different types of money that are lying and waiting to be sent to Ukraine. Unfortunately, we are very short of funds, and we are short of the line of partners that are ready to provide us sustainable long-term aid. And there is certain progress made in the US. They registered in the Congress the so-called Repo Act, and which would enable the administration to do the confiscation and transfer this sovereign, Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine. It is right now being debated. It passed the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, and we are very closely following the dynamics, because we think that the positive precedent of having a country like the US adopting the proper legislation to do the confiscation would be a very powerful motivation for the European countries. So basically what we need right now is the consensus on the G7 level, political consensus, political decision that this is the right way to move forward. What is very important, that the confiscation cannot substitute the currently debated American and European packages of assistance. They need to come separately, and they are desperately needed, and we hope that they will be approved as soon as possible. But we need to think ahead for the 25 and afterwards, because if such issues appear today, they will obviously, you know, be even deepened in a year. So we need the political decision of G7 to do this, and then, you know, implementation on the national level, like the US is trying to do, like Canada is in the process of doing. There is the legislation submitted to the UK Parliament as well. And to be honest, I am kind of cautiously optimistic with regards to the statements of the Foreign Secretary David Cameron, who said last week that the assets should not be just frozen waiting for something, but they should be offset as the payment for the future payments of the reparations for Russians, which means that that he seems to be open for the confiscation.
He did link the funds to reconstruction as opposed to being able to spend it on armaments and munitions. Is that another barrier that needs to be overcome? You know, once the funds released, you need to be able to spend those on what you need right now, rather than reconstruction, which comes later.
You're absolutely right that these funds should be released under a very specific goal, you know, for purpose, because otherwise there will be many different claimants who would want to get a bite of this money. We, of course, are advocating for using this money for Ukraine's self-defense. We are fine, with the reconstruction, because some reconstruction needs to be done right now, immediately, urgently, like the energy reconstruction or the infrastructure for our exports. Everything that needs to keep our economy alive is super necessary. But indeed, I would say that this is quite a brave idea, which we are advocating for, that this money should also be used for the self-defense. There could be mechanisms introduced in order to make sure that it is done properly, and that this money is used in our international partners that are providing us with the arms and who have the production of the arms, which we call for ramping up fastly. So there can be creative ideas and creative initiatives, but everything will take place only when there is political will. And here we are, at this point where we do not have this political will, because there are still people among our decision makers, foreign decision makers, who still think that this money could be used as the bargaining chip with the negotiations with Russia. But Russia doesn't want negotiations. Russia doesn't want peace. Russia wants Ukraine either conquered or destroyed. There's no other way.
And that's what I was going to come to next. So I've got a quick question about the location of the frozen assets, but then we'll come to Russia. So the first question then, so it's hugely symbolic for the US and Canada to be passing these laws, but where does the majority of these frozen assets sit? The EU is a far more significant repository of these funds, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Most of these funds are in the European Union. We do not have the clear information, because this information is still concealed. We are having the data that was published by the Russian Central Bank before the beginning of the full-scale war in 2021. But we also know that since then, Russia was pulling away some reserves from the US and pouring them into European Union. Why? Because Russia anticipated harsh sanctions from the US, but they hoped very much that European Union would not join that. That was obviously their very big miscalculation. With regards to Europe, most of the assets, a lot of the assets are in Belgium, because there is this clearing institution, Euroclear, which froze a number of assets, transactions, but there is, there are not only Russian sovereign assets there, but also private assets and transactions. So there's kind of a very big mixture of what is frozen there. So they are reporting that they froze something like up to 200 billion euros. But it's not clear. They are not providing the breakdown by the type of either assets or transactions. Also, Russia reported in 2021 that they had assets in France and in Germany. But again, no clarity on the numbers, and the countries, unfortunately, are not publishing those data because of, from my perspective, absolutely unjustified excuses. And there is also part of the assets that were frozen in Japan, but that's something like $20 billion, analog in Japanese yenas.
And one of the challenges also, you were warning about the long-scale war and the impact. One of the reasons those warnings were given last year is because Russia doesn't only operate in the military aggression space, but grey zone or hybrid warfare is also a key part of its strategy. And what we've seen in this last year is countries ostensibly supportive of Ukraine have started to experience changes of government, in particular Slovakia and even the Netherlands have taken a turn which is going to complicate these trans-European votes, and where every country potentially has a veto over consensus, we see major problems on the horizon. And if it wasn't clear to people before, Viktor Orban is little more than a vassal of the Kremlin, a sort of Kremlin puppet. This, even if you get consensus from the majority of leaders, there are these so-called flies in the ointment who could try to block decisions.
Yes, that's a very big problem. And in the end of this week, there will be EU Council where a number of life-saving critical decisions for Ukraine will be made. And the news that are coming ahead of the summit are very, very discouraging. Because the EU Council will be deciding on the opening of EU accession talks with Ukraine. And just yesterday and today, there were two very important statements from the Hungarian and Slovakian minorities groups from Ukraine, who were calling Charles Michel and Viktor Orban and Prime Minister Fico to start negotiations process, because they were acknowledging a very huge progress Ukraine has made in improving the national minorities legislation over the last 2 years after Ukraine received the EU candidate status, meaning that even minorities are recognizing the progress and the need for Ukraine to start accession talks as not only very symbolic step, but a super practical reapproachment with the European Union. But is Orban really caring about the rights of Hungarian national minorities, or is he using this as an excuse? Well, I think that, his behavior would be the best judgment and evidence whose side he's standing with. The second important issue that will be considered at the summit is this very big Ukraine facility aid. That is the 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine for the 4 years. And this is primarily the money that is supposed to be used for the macro financial assistance. So for the stability of our economy and for the kind of state needs like pensions and salaries and whatever else non-military Ukraine needs to continue existing and running the economy and the state. So this is super important, and it is, endangered by Orban too. And, if for the EU accession talks, he, figured out a very stupid excuse, repeating that Ukraine is corrupt, Ukraine hasn't reformed, we cannot start the accession process of the country, which doesn't have, borders set. I mean, we have borders set. It is Russia which is doing the aggression and illegally crossed those borders. But I mean, Ukraine has borders, and why Orban is challenging this, that is a very big question.
I shared that on the channel the other day. There's a remarkable chart which reflects a number of key indices on corruption, and it shows that systematically since 2013, Ukraine has improved transparency. Obviously, there's still a long way to go, but it's improved transparency incrementally year on year since 2013. In the same period, since Orban took over, Hungary has declined to the point where it's actually below Ukraine for certain indices on the international corruption and transparency statistics. So this is not just an objectionable argument for Ukraine from Orban. It's absolutely hypocritical.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm an anti-corruption activist in the more peaceful times, and I have to say that it's very often overlooked. But after 2014, Ukraine has achieved tremendous progress in fight against corruption, testing and trying new innovative approaches, which can be later, shared as the experience with other transitional democracies. But yes, this argument, unfortunately, is very often abused against Ukraine instead of speaking about a big progress that we made in order to close the loopholes that existed, before 2013. People continue repeating this Russian propaganda that we are utterly corrupt. But Orban also plans to block this financial assistance. And here he doesn't even have, a convincing argument, because the country is defending from the genocidal war and desperately needs the money to continue surviving. And he just blocks it because, because that's Putin's goal, to cut Western assistance and make sure that it's much more complicated for Ukraine to continue defending ourselves. So, and this consensus approach is a very big problem. It is very well understood by the EU member states, and I know that they are having a lot of the discussions and negotiations, what can be changed without changing the treaties. Because changing the treaties would take decades, and not clear whether that would be successful or not, because the last change of treaties basically stuck. It was never implemented fully because not all of the countries could have ratified it. So some things can be changed right now. Like, for example, a few years ago, the EU improved the methodology for the accession process monitoring, where they made more focus on the fundamentals. This is rule of law, anti-corruption, so everything related to the operation of the state. But they also introduced the consensus voting for each and every stage of the accession process, meaning that opening the chapter, setting the benchmarks, approving benchmarks implementation, closing the chapter. So everything needs the consensus, meaning that, countries like Hungary would have plenty of opportunities to block Ukraine on the accession process anytime. So our colleagues from the New Europe Center are right now very closely working on this issue because this methodology needs to be changed. Otherwise, it makes the process of the EU integration completely invalid. And this very, developments that are happening right now with Hungary prove that the risk is extremely real.
And we'll come back to that in a minute, because that causes issues in a number of different areas. Let's turn to the point you made earlier, and this is that Russia's war aims have not changed. And I don't like quoting really directly from the Yadovitya Kremlovsky Karlik, Vladimir Putin, but he made, I think, what was a very important statement. Now, he was surrounded by military people. He was drinking. He seems to say the most ridiculous things when he's got a glass of wine or something in his hand. But I think this was an incredibly important statement. He said, referring to Ukraine, you don't have your own industry, your own industrial base. You don't have your own money. You don't have your own ideology, which is a very odd phrase to use. And he said, you don't have a future, but we do. Now, this, to me at least, is a clear indication that not only have Russia's war ambitions not changed, but the more extreme elements of those ambitions now seem to be more realistic for Putin and his propagandists. I don't know if you sort of heard or saw that clip and how you interpret it.
Well, it's absolutely clear. They mean what they say, and that's something, which many Western opinion leaders or analysts, experts are very often missing, that they are trying, to interpret this the way, how that could have been said or explained, or maybe it is not that what he said or whatever else. I mean, they are very openly claiming the genocidal nature of this war. They want to take over Ukraine, while Ukraine is defending itself and doesn't want to go into the occupation. Then the only destiny and fate which they see for Ukraine is destroying it. And the more weapons they have for that, the easier for them it would be to pursue this goal. And unfortunately, they are learning very fast. There was this very dangerous switch from overstatement of Russia to understatement of Russia. So first, everybody, was sure that Russia will take over Kyiv in 3 days, and then, the world started seeing them as stupid idiots who cannot do anything, properly. They are just throwing people into the mid-Granger. Well, yes, they are throwing people into the mid-Granger, but they are also improving technologies, unfortunately. And while, our partners are slowing down this assistance, speaking about the stalemate, speaking about the line of fighting not moving, Russia is using every single day in order to improve their drone technologies, in order to build more missiles, in order to build more drones, in order to get more people, in order to try and break Ukraine's defense lines. So what we are trying, to ring the alarm bell to our partners, that the West is sleepwalking into a very big disaster, because Russia won't stop with Ukraine. If Russia succeeds in winning in Ukraine, they will definitely move forward. Why? Because they understand very well what are the weaknesses of the West. Because they heard last year the promises to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, and then, all of a sudden in 2 years, it is already not as long as it was promised. So Russia understands very well that the West is not ready to protect your democracy, your values. The West hasn't even ramped up the military production. And I think that this is super shameful that North Korea is capable of providing Russia with more artillery ammunition than entire European Union to support Ukraine's existential fight. I mean, the good, which is not capable of defending itself, is doomed for the defeat. And I'm shocked that so many people do not understand this very simple trajectory into which our entire world is right now moving. I mean, take a look what is happening in Venezuela right now. Why would a dictator decide, to annex the part of the neighboring independent country, if not him seeing the world responding to Putin with weaknesses? I mean, weakness. It encourages much more aggression, much more wars, and much more violence. I mean, I think that this can still be stopped with supporting Ukrainian victory, but the dynamics of assistance and the dynamics of the opinions is going absolutely the opposite.
That's correct, and I'm going to get some terrible comments here. But if we turn to the first Gulf War, where the US and its allies ejected Iraq from Kuwait, that was to uphold the idea of international sovereign borders. And then there's a period of time, of course, where people think, okay, maybe that's not such a good idea. Venezuela also has deep connections to Russia, as all dare I say it, sort of, axis of evil or, authoritarian regimes do. The other point that I think has been made is that Hamas's attack in the Middle East happened on Putin's birthday. And whereas I believe there are coincidences happen in democracies all the time, there are no coincidences in autocracies. And yet, do you fear that both Western media and decision makers are not joining the dots and seeing some of these acts as part of a wider hybrid or gray zone warfare technique?
Well, I think that, the World War III should not necessarily start as one very big war. It can start with many regional wars that will eventually merge into the one very big war and one very big fighting. And of course, I think that everything is connected. I mean, Hamas is the proxy of Iran. Iran is the ally of Russia. So, I mean, everything is very clear. We are having while the coalition of democracies is falling apart, the coalition of dictators is getting much more stronger. I mean, at the very beginning of the full-scale war, Russia was alone with Belarus. Then, Iran joined with the supplies of drones and, started the trainings for the Russian soldiers, etc., etc. Then, North Korea joined them as well. Now we are seeing, that China is providing non-lethal goods, but maybe much more. Now we are seeing that Venezuela is also, joining this massive chaos-making activities with their own planned occupation, etc., etc. So everything is interlinked and everything is interconnected. And what dictators very well understood from the latest news developments is that the West cannot handle many wars simultaneously. And the fact that some of the aid and assistance was refocused from Ukraine to Israel proves that the biggest vulnerability of the West is that the West hasn't ramped up production to make sure that they can support their partners who are defending themselves from unjust attacks, and simultaneously, make sure that their own stockpiles are not empty. This is complete failure.
It sounds, from what I heard, South Korea is the only country with the industrial capacity and with a large enough stockpile. And that's essentially because they've had a frozen conflict for the last however many, sort of 70 years or so. Let's turn to the Russian economy, because this is another area where the West seems to have had critical over and underestimations. They have vastly overestimated the power of their sanctions to cripple the Russian economy. They've vastly underestimated the capacity of Russia to come up with mechanisms to get around the oil price cap, the creation of the grey fleet, the unfortunate competence of Elvira Nabiullina and her central bank team in actually steadying the Russian economy and preventing it from collapsing fully. Again, there seems to be some terrible miscalculations into what is a very, very important part of what was supposed to be an effort to cripple the Russian war machine, and it hasn't.
I don't think that this was a miscalculation. I think that such approach was deemed to be failure from the very beginning for a very simple reasons. When the sanctions were designed, they were designed with a certain loopholes. You cannot sanction 10 banks and leave out of the sanctions, 300 other banks, because that's not how the sanctions work. You cannot introduce the price cap, which is pretty high, and then, do not impose the sanctions for the evasion of the price cap, because you take care about the Greek oligarchs who are, having the interest in shipping. You cannot introduce the technology sanctions to make sure that Western-made cheap semiconductors and whatever other technologies doesn't end in the Russian missiles and drones, and then you do not introduce the sanctions for the evasion, because your European companies' competitive advantages would be lost. I mean, I think that the biggest problem here is that the West still lives in the peacetime, and the West still hopes that this is just Russia-Ukrainian war, which will end up with something, peace negotiations, freezing, whatever else, and it won't touch them. But if you take a look at the rhetoric, and again, I'm not watching, Putin, he's propagandist, but I'm very grateful for people like Julia Davis and others who are doing this very hard and bad job in order to help convey those messages to people in the West. But they are very openly cheering and planning further invasions, further plans, how to attack NATO countries, occupy some countries in the eastern flank. But everybody says
Romania, Poland, they list them openly, and they talk
and
about
Baltic
what they're
states.
Gonna do.
It's very clear, but many want, to say that, oh, this is propaganda, we do not trust it. But this is the reality. And the sooner the West wakes up to this reality, the better it would be for everyone.
That's right. I mean, it's now, I've heard probably half a dozen times, Solovyov. Now, people have to remember, these propagandists, it's a form of theatre, it's a form of political theatre, but they don't make statements. The anchors, at least, don't make statements that aren't fully approved by the Kremlin administration. And Solovyov has mentioned several times that Russian influence, if not Russian empire, needs to stretch from from the eastern Sakhalin all the way through to Lisbon. If people are not listening, Lisbon, quite a long way from Moscow. And the technique, of course, is to occupy a territory and then use its resources and materials and its population, weaponize them, and turn them into an army, and then turn those people against the next territory, and the next territory, and the next territory. If people think this is fantastical, this has been the strategy for 400 years. How did Muscovy grow from a small enclave on the sort of swamps of Muscovy to become one of the largest land empires in history? This is the exact strategy they adopted. How do we sort of counter that? How do we get this message across? Because, as you know, I attend events on a weekly basis to do with politics, culture, etc., to do with Ukraine and the Russian war. And I still hear these phrases come up, for as long as it takes, and land for peace. Even now, these phrases and these questions are still being asked. How do we move beyond that to a concept of full Ukrainian victory as quickly as we can?
Jonathan, thank you very much for basically explaining very well this kind of the occupation strategy and tactics of Russia, because many people ignore that, and they do not want to accept that Russia, in the first phases of the full-scale war, Russia was basically mostly throwing people mobilized from the earlier occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, meaning that they were basically using Ukrainians in the Russian war against Ukraine. and of course along with Russians, but on the first line of this mid-Granger they were throwing Ukrainians, and that is exactly their plan, how to move forward with further invasions. And I think that Ukrainians understand it very well, that the occupation would not mean peace, it would mean another war, but on the side of aggressor, unfortunately. And that is also a very good motivation for us to be defending ourselves, defending our freedom, because we want real sustainable peace. What we are doing, we are trying to explain what is the occupation. I think that that at a certain point people stopped perceiving this information. When you are explaining to them the horrible tortures that are happening, that Russians are doing in the occupied territories, like gang raping kids, torturing in the basements, deportation and kidnapping and brainwashing, and putting kids into the Russian families and erasing their identities, and assassinations, and mass graves. And I mean, I can continue this list almost indefinitely, unfortunately. For many it's easier to say, we know that something very bad is happening there, we know that it's bad. Or something like Samuel Charap told me when he answered my question in Estonia at the Lennart Murray conference, that something like, it is a tough decision for the government to choose whether they will be fighting for people who are in the occupation with the price of people who are, in the army. But the thing is, which is very often overlooked, that the cost of fighting can be decreased by the timely supplies of the arms, of the proper arms, in time and in the proper quantities. If Ukrainian army had F-16 fighter jets for the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives, the situation would be absolutely dramatically different on the front lines. But the cost for people in the occupation cannot be changed without liberating them. It is, either yes or no. And that is why that's something what we are trying to explain. That's something what your podcast is trying to explain. But my feeling is that in the last months, we have even less appetite to hear that, to understand that, as if, if Russian genocide disappeared from the international media, it probably disappeared from Ukraine too, but it hasn't. I mean, Russia is killing every day innocent civilians with their strikes, with their artillery shelling of the towns close to the front line, but also with their missile and drone attacks across entire country. And I mean, they are killing people on the front line who are, military because they have to defend their own country. And they are not professional military. And all these things, they continue happening. And cutting the aid and support for Ukraine would mean dooming much more people for this fate, destiny, for tortures, for the captivity. Many people seem to forget that we still have many Azovstal defenders, Mariupol defenders, who are still in the Russian captivity, who were not exchanged, and Russia doesn't seem to rush to exchange them. And I think that international partners could do much more in helping us to get these people released free, because every day in the captivity is equal to 1 year of life in the freedom. And all those things, they need to be explained. But I think that, the window is closing, because the window was very open last year, and Western leaders, they completely screwed it up because they hoped for the escalation management approach. And escalation management approach proved to be a big failure that ended up with more wars already happening or upcoming, and this is just the beginning.
And it's a failure to understand, I think, the Russian mindset, which I find it extraordinary. Many others who are sort of experts in the area, I think, now are finding it extraordinary and frustrating. You just have to look at the treatment of the prisoners of war in the Olenivka camp, where Russia bombed the camp, and that's just one of many criminal acts. This, I think, ties very well what you've said there, and the requirements for victory and why it's so important, ties that back to really our starting conversation, which is about why these funds need to be released, and not just released in lieu of the sort of grants and monies, but actually both tranches need to be released in order to get victory faster. And again, that's not an excuse for not providing F-16s, for dramatically scaling up the provision of heavy armor, ammunition, etc. Time is running out because, as you say, Ukraine is not such a big country and does not have the scale of human resources that Russia does. But what Ukraine does have is a sense of value of those human resources. It doesn't want to sort of waste them and use them without some kind of purpose. But we really risk mistiming everything at this point, don't we?
Yes, that is true. That is a very real risk.
Well, Olena, thank you so much for coming onto the channel. Thank you for your forceful description of these issues. I encourage anyone listening to this to take quotes from the video, forward them on to your representatives, to your lawmakers, your decision makers. Don't just listen to this information, but engage in some kind of activism and push harder for your governments to take action on all the topics that we've talked about. Olena, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you very much for this podcast. It is a very important and valuable contribution to our victory, because besides everything, I'm still convinced that Ukraine is capable of winning this war. We are extremely grateful to everybody who continues standing with us, who continues demanding from their government more aid in time and of the necessary scale. And please continue doing this. We value you. We are very grateful, and thank you very much.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.